It's 2024 and that means one thing. Pre-season testing is with us and what a treat that is. 10 brand new shiny Formula One cars to talk about. Some of the most exciting engineering of the year is already on display going around the circuit in Bahrain. There's so much to talk about. We're just going to be able to bring you some of the technical highlights right now, but we are going to get into all of the details through the rest of the season, so stay with us. But where else to start than with last year's world champions Red Bull? Take a look at this beautiful new car, the RB20. And there's some really interesting bits about this car. From the moment it was launched, it became quite apparent that there were some design details on this car that looked a little bit familiar. And if they look familiar to you, take a look at last year's Mercedes. Not the updated car that they finished the season with, but the one that they discovered that didn't work particularly well without the full-size side pods on. And if you look at this upper section here, it's really obvious. You have this very high engine cover with some deeply dished sections just underneath that Red Bull logo. Then around this section of the car, you've got that very distinctive protruding upper section of the side pod. Red Bull moving away from that lower lip protrusion that they had all the way through the RB19 and the RB20 that loads of other cars have copied this season. They have retained the front pull rod suspension. That was pretty much a done deal from the word go. Adrian Newey loves that concept. Now, if you look around this section of the Red Bull, of course, it is very similar in concept at very least to last year's Mercedes, and you can see those details. But one of the big things about last year's Mercedes was that very distinctive vertical cooling slot. Well, when Red Bull launched this car, the launch renders didn't have all of the cooling slots on at all. There was no cooling available on that car. And then Red Bull showed a car off but didn't let anyone have a really close look at it. There was a big mystery as to what was going on in this area of the car. Well, we can now reveal what is actually going on in that part of the car. And it's a little bit more involved than anybody first realised. Actually, what Red Bull have done is they've relocated some of the cooling around the car to make that zero side pod concept work. If they go to the full zero side pod concept at all, which they are rumoured to be doing for the Japanese Grand Prix, we'll have to wait and see if they really do that, because they have done something very different to Mercedes to get it all working. And we took a look at Max Verstappen's car going around the circuit in Bahrain, and that's when we noticed what they'd actually done. So take a look here. You can see just behind Verstappen's helmet, you can see this very distinctive and very well hidden additional cooling inlet, and there's one either side of the cockpit. You can see another one just sticking out behind his head there. Now, these little cooling inlets are, well, they're not that little, they're quite significant. We're not entirely sure yet what it is they are cooling, but they are doing a lot of work. And also, it's quite important to remember, because they're located quite high up on the car, it is possible that they will be getting some nice and clean airflow from the front of the car. Nice clean laminar airflow into the coolers means they could go slightly more extreme on what they're doing. And this relocation of coolers could allow Red Bull to get away from the trap that Mercedes fell into of having to move the driver forwards in this car, closer to the front axle, which the drivers absolutely hated in that Mercedes. But what are Red Bull doing with the side pods? That's a question that we've been banging on about since the car launched. Well, we can actually reveal that now for the first time. And as we take a close look inside the Red Bull garage, diving in and having a look at that corner of the car, well, the mechanics don't really want us to look too closely, but we managed to anyway. And you can see in this footage very clearly that there are two cooling inlets, two very separate inlets actually, on the side pod entry. You've got a vertical slit here. Now, this is very similar to the one that you see on both this year's and last year's Ferraris, but also there's a quite large additional inlet, I guess you'd call it, underneath the overbite, if you like, the leading edge of the side pod. And those two coolers work in addition to the two behind the driver's head to give you the complete cooling package. And that, I think, is quite an interesting arrangement, and one that's a little different to what Mercedes were doing. So it's going to be very interesting to see if Red Bull can make that work on the car. And let's not forget that Mercedes failed to make that work at all. And Mercedes themselves, they've been looking at some other really quite interesting design decisions on their car. Essentially, all of the bits that Red Bull have copied from last year's Mercedes, Mercedes have given up on, and Red Bull have gone their own way on. But that's not to say the Mercedes isn't interesting at all. Here is the front wing of the silver and black Arrows car, I guess we have to call it now. And you will notice a really interesting piece of design on the upper element of the front wing. You'll notice that the upper element, that fourth element, doesn't really exist. It's sort of it's almost a string or a very thin strip of carbon fibre that's linked to a much larger outer element. Now the link section between these two is almost microscopic. It's entirely thin, but it is there. And the reason that Mercedes has done this is that they don't really want too much of a wing surface in this section, but they do want this old-fashioned style front wing shape. If you look back at the pre-2022 cars, you'd see a really distinctive upper element like that as the teams were trying to make the front wings work the way they wanted to. Well, Mercedes, because the regulations say if you want to have a fourth element of the front wing up there, you're allowed to have up to 4 elements. There's no regulation saying you have to have 4 elements. You could have 3. Nobody's going that route. They all have to link with both the inner face of the chassis and the outer face of the end plate, just out of shot here. The only way Mercedes could do this was to create an absolutely tiny, and you can just about see it here, an absolutely tiny link section between the wider proper element of the front wing here and just this new tiny sliver wing, if you want to call it that. And that's a way that Mercedes have got around the technical regulations and made the car do what they really want it to. If I roll this forwards, we can just watch the mechanics working around that section of the front wing. You can see that front wing section, it's barely touching. But because it is touching, there is this tiny piece of linkage, it makes that front wing meet the technical regulations. And as you see the car out on track, I thought at first the front wing was even broken in this section here because it didn't look like it was connected, but it was. And that's what Mercedes have done to get around the rules. But another thing you need to look at on this front end of the Mercedes is the position of the nose. Mercedes have gone to a shorter nose. It's shorter, it's fatter, and it picks up on the second element of the front wing, not the leading edge of the first element of the front wing as it did last season. Well, that's copying Red Bull, who had that feature on the RB19. But as I said before, Red Bull, well, they've taken slightly different directions this year. And as you can see on the front of the RB20, Red Bull have done the opposite to Mercedes. You can see between the mechanics' legs, they like keeping their car very covered up here, Red Bull. They have the leading edge of the front wing and a big wide nose meeting that leading edge. And that's going against a trend we've seen up and down the pit lane. So a lot of teams, Haas included, take a look at the Haas. They've adopted very much the Red Bull approach on that front wing, where the nose picks up on the second element with a couple of little bridge sections. And that's something you'll see that Aston Martin have adopted this year, following the Red Bull RB20 concept. It's just that an awful lot of teams have gone the way that Red Bull have decided to move away from. So that's quite an interesting little detail. First look at the Sauber front wing, and you can see they've gone to the leading edge of the front wing as well. So they've gone a very different direction. Again, that's an interesting car. We'll have to take a look at that in more detail later in the week. One team I wanted to take a slightly closer look at is the RB team, previously known as AlphaTauri, Toro Rosso, and even before that Minardi. But Red Bull's other Formula One team, the Italian-based one, have stuck with a concept that we've seen for quite a while on a number of cars, around the rear view mirror. Now you can see around the main mirror housing, you have this C-shaped section that's got a slight winglet on it. What that's all about is reducing the drag of the wing mirror, and it's something we've seen a lot of teams do over the years, invest hugely in hugely complicated mirrors. Well, coming into the start of this season and looking at the cars launching and looking at the cars in Bahrain, I was quite surprised to see that an awful lot of cars, like Ferrari, have gone for a very conventional mirror housing. Yeah, they've still got the complicated mounts to the chassis and to the side pod, but they haven't got those complicated drag-reducing mirror housings at all. Not really sure what that's about, so we're going to have to dig into it. It's certainly aerodynamic, but surely a drag-reducing mirror would be better than a higher drag mirror. So that's a little bit of a mystery to me. Ferrari, though, have a number of interesting elements on the car. We saw them running a hugely complex set of sensor arrays behind the front wheels, and that's not the only place where Ferrari were running aerodynamic monitoring equipment on the opening morning of testing. One of the things that Ferrari was really looking at with its other sensor array in particular, you can see that just located back here, is a quite interesting little bit of engineering around the rear of the halo. Ferrari have created this bridge section linking to the halo to the top of the side pod. That's something we've not seen in these current generation of cars before, and it's something I think a number of teams will be taking a look at. Its exact purpose isn't clear. Of course, it's aerodynamic, but you can't really tell what they're doing about a wind tunnel. As the car goes through the corner, you get a slightly clearer view of how that section bridges to the upper bodywork. You can see it quite neatly there. It's very clear to see. Just on the lower section, it's worth noting that this part of the bridge section here is unconnected. That's actually a cooling outlet from the leading edge of the side pod, but you can see that bridge section very clearly just there. And as the car keeps going through the corner, you can see how it links to the halo. That's something I think you might see quite a number of teams copying as the season goes on, if they decide that the Ferrari solution is the right way to go. Now, on the topic of stuff around the cockpit and around the halo, just have a quick look at this detail on the McLaren Oscar Piastri in the car. You can see the side pod ducting there, pretty conventional, a little bit smaller maybe than last year. But for me, the real interest is actually on the mirror support here. Very conventional mirror housing, but McLaren have introduced this little winglet above the side pod. Very much inspired, I think, again by the Mercedes W14, but this section doesn't contain the side impact structure like it did on the Mercedes. So a little bit of an aerodynamic gain from the mirror housing there for McLaren. They were quite keen to keep this a secret, as they were with some details around their front suspension. We'll be taking a closer look at that in the next couple of days. Another car I think we need to take a closer look at just now, and it's going to be the last for this afternoon, is taking a look at the brand new Williams, the FW46. It took to the track for the very first time just yesterday, and the team have been super keen to keep this car a bit of a secret. Still trying to understand a bit more about it. They've retained the push rod front end, but they've also retained the suspension layout from last year. And to do that, that means they've had to retain the Mercedes transmission casing from last year and not gone to the new gearbox, where Mercedes have swapped around their suspension year on year. There's another few little details on there. They've gone slightly more Red Bullish, RB19-ish on the side pod duct, but we're going to have to take a much deeper look at that car as the test goes on and as the season begins, because I think there's a lot to learn about this Williams, and could it be the start of a new era for the British team? But one thing we can say for certain is that this is the start of an exciting new season of Formula One.